There are countries that have been poor for centuries, countries with vast natural resources, oil, gold, diamonds, fertile land, everything needed for prosperity. And yet they remain poor. Their people struggle, their economies stagnate, and the gap between them and wealthy nations grows wider every year. This is not an accident. It is not bad luck. And it is not, as many believe, simply a matter of time. Because poor countries do not become rich by waiting. They become rich by breaking out of traps. Traps that are invisible to most people. Traps built into their legal systems, their cultures, their governments, and their histories. These traps are so powerful that entire continents remain trapped in poverty despite trillions of dollars in aid, despite natural resources that should make them wealthy, and despite generations of educated people trying to escape. The question is not why poor countries are poor. That is easy to explain. The question is why they stay poor. Why, after decades of independence, after receiving more foreign aid than any region in history, after technological advances that should have lifted everyone, do so many countries remain trapped at the bottom? The answer will challenge everything you think you know about poverty, development, and economic progress. This is The Wealth Records, where every video will change how you see money, history, and the systems controlling your life. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what you're about to learn explains more about the world than any other economic concept. And once you see it, you will never look at global poverty the same way again. Why do you think poor countries stay poor? Resources? Colonialism? Corruption? Culture? Drop your theory below and let's see if it matches what the evidence shows. Let us start by eliminating the explanations that do not work. Because most people, when asked why poor countries are poor, give answers that sound reasonable but do not match reality. The first explanation people offer is lack of resources. Poor countries, they say, do not have oil, minerals, or fertile land. If they had resources, they would be rich. But this is false. Some of the poorest countries on earth are among the most resource-rich. The Democratic Republic of Congo has more mineral wealth than almost any country on the planet. Copper, cobalt, diamonds, gold, coltan. If resources determined wealth, Congo would be one of the richest nations on earth. Instead, it is one of the poorest. Its people earn less than $2 per day. Infrastructure barely exists. Wars over resources have killed millions. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Russia, and yet Venezuela's economy has collapsed. Its currency is worthless. Its people are starving. Millions have fled. If oil made countries rich, Venezuela would be thriving. Nigeria has been pumping oil for over 60 years. It has earned hundreds of billions of dollars, and yet most Nigerians live in poverty. Infrastructure is crumbling. Corruption is endemic. The resource wealth has not translated into prosperity for ordinary people. Meanwhile, countries with almost no natural resources are among the richest. Singapore has no oil, no minerals, no agricultural land. It is a tiny island that imports even its drinking water. And yet, Singapore is one of the wealthiest countries on earth. Switzerland has no oil, no significant natural resources, just mountains. And it is one of the richest countries in Europe. Japan has almost no natural resources. It imports nearly all its energy and raw materials. And yet, it became the second largest economy in the world. South Korea was one of the poorest countries on earth in 1950, poorer than most of Africa. It had no resources. And within 50 years, it became one of the richest. The pattern is undeniable. Resources do not make countries rich. In fact, in many cases, resources make countries poorer. This is called the resource curse. And it is one of the most well-documented phenomena in economics. The second explanation people offer is foreign aid. Poor countries, they say, need money. If wealthy countries would just give more aid, poverty would end. But this is also false. Africa has received over $2 trillion in foreign aid since 1960. $2 trillion. More aid per capita than any region in history. And yet most of Africa remains poor. In many cases, poorer than before the aid started. Zambia received billions in aid over decades. Its economy did not grow. It stagnated. When aid was cut in the 1990s and market reforms were introduced, the economy finally started growing. Ethiopia received massive aid for decades, remained desperately poor. When the government shifted toward market policies in the 2000s, growth accelerated. Aid does not create prosperity. In many cases, it prevents it. Because aid flows to governments, and governments in poor countries are often corrupt. Aid money gets stolen, or it gets spent on projects that do not generate economic returns. Prestige projects, stadiums, government buildings, monuments, or it creates dependency. When a country receives free food aid, local farmers cannot compete. They stop producing. The country becomes dependent on imports. When aid pays for schools and hospitals, governments do not develop the tax systems needed to fund these services themselves. They become permanently dependent on donors. And when aid stops, the services collapse. There are countries that have received almost no foreign aid and have thrived. Botswana received little aid compared to its neighbors, and yet it is one of the few African success stories. Its economy grew faster than almost any country in the world from 1966 to 2000. Why? Not because of aid, because it built functioning institutions. Aid is not the solution. In many cases, it is part of the problem. The third explanation is colonialism. Poor countries, people say, were exploited by European powers. Their resources were extracted. Their people enslaved or oppressed. And this legacy of exploitation explains their poverty today. There is truth to this. Colonialism was exploitative. It extracted wealth. It disrupted societies. It drew arbitrary borders that ignored ethnic and cultural boundaries. And in many cases, it left behind weak or corrupt institutions. But colonialism cannot be the full explanation, because the legacy of colonialism varies wildly depending on which colonial power was involved and what institutions they left behind. India was colonized by Britain for nearly 200 years. Exploited? No question. And yet, India today, while still developing, has a functioning democracy, a legal system based on British common law, property rights, and a growing economy. It is not rich, but it is not trapped in the same poverty as many African nations. Hong Kong was a colonial possession of Britain, taken by force, and yet it became one of the wealthiest places on earth. Why? Because the British established rule of law, property rights, and free trade. When Britain handed it back to China in 1997, Hong Kong was richer per capita than Britain itself. Botswana was a British protectorate, colonized, and yet after independence, it used the institutions left behind, property rights, rule of law, and combined them with prudent governance. It became one of Africa's success stories. Meanwhile, countries colonized by Belgium, like Congo, were left with almost nothing. No infrastructure, no institutions, just extraction and brutality. And Congo has never recovered. Countries colonized by Portugal, like Mozambique and Angola, were left similarly devastated. The Portuguese built nothing, extracted everything, left weak institutions. And these countries have struggled ever since. The type of colonialism mattered. The institutions left behind mattered. But even more importantly, what countries did after independence mattered. South Korea was occupied by Japan, exploited. And yet, after independence, South Korea built institutions and grew rapidly. Singapore was colonized, and yet it thrived. The question is not whether colonialism hurt these countries. It did. The question is why some countries recovered and others did not. And the answer lies in institutions. This brings us to the real explanation. The reason poor countries stay poor is institutions, or more precisely, the lack of good institutions. Institutions are the rules, laws, and systems that govern how a society functions. Property rights, rule of law, contract enforcement, courts that are not corrupt, governments that do not steal, regulations that are predictable and fair, police that protect rather than extort. These are institutions, and they are the foundation of prosperity. Countries with good institutions become rich. Countries with bad institutions stay poor. This is not a theory. It is one of the most robust findings in all of economics. Darren Acemoglu, Simon Johnson, and James Robinson won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2024 for this research. They studied hundreds of countries over centuries. And the pattern is undeniable. Institutions explain almost everything. Why does this matter so much? Because institutions determine whether people can invest, trade, and create wealth without fear of it being stolen. If you live in a country where property rights are not protected, where the government can seize your business at any time, where courts are corrupt and contracts are not enforced, you will not invest. You will not start a business. You will not innovate. Because there is no point. Any wealth you create can be taken. So you do not create wealth. You survive. You keep your money hidden. You avoid attention. And the entire economy stagnates. This is what economists call extractive institutions. Institutions designed to extract wealth from the population and concentrate it in the hands of a small elite. Extractive institutions do not create prosperity. They prevent it. And they are the norm in poor countries. Let us compare two countries to see how institutions create opposite outcomes, North Korea and South Korea. In 1945, Korea was one country, same people, same culture, same history, same language. Then it was divided. North Korea adopted communism, extractive institutions. The state controlled everything. No private property, no markets, no freedom. South Korea, after a rocky start, adopted capitalism, built institutions that protected property rights, encouraged trade, open to foreign investment. Today, South Korea is one of the richest countries in the world. Its GDP per capita exceeds $30,000. It produces Samsung, Hyundai, LG. It is a global leader in technology and manufacturing. North Korea is one of the poorest. Its GDP per capita is estimated at less than $2,000. Its people are malnourished. There's no internet, no freedom. The economy exists to serve the regime. Same people, same geography, same starting point. The only difference is institutions, or consider East and West Germany. Same country, same people. Divided after World War II, East Germany adopted communism, West Germany adopted capitalism. By 1989, West Germany was one of the richest countries in Europe. East Germany was poor, gray, stagnant. When the Berlin Wall fell, the East German economy was so far behind that it took decades and trillions of euros to bring it even close to parity. Same people, same culture, different institutions, different outcomes. The pattern repeats everywhere. Botswana and Zimbabwe, neighbors, similar resources. Botswana protected property rights, avoided corruption, and built strong institutions. Zimbabwe did the opposite. Mugabe seized white-owned farms and redistributed them, destroyed property rights, drove out investors. The result? Botswana thrived. Zimbabwe collapsed into hyperinflation and poverty. Chile and Venezuela, both in Latin America, both had oil and resources. Chile adopted free market reforms in the 1970s and 1980s, built strong institutions. Today, it is the richest country in South America. Venezuela rejected markets, embraced socialism, and destroyed its institutions. Today, it is collapsing. Institutions are everything. But here is the trap. Bad institutions are self-perpetuating. Once a country has extractive institutions, it is extremely difficult to change them because the people in power benefit from those institutions. They are extracting wealth. They have no incentive to change the system. In fact, they have every incentive to prevent change. If you are a dictator in a poor country, your wealth comes from controlling the state. You award contracts to your friends. You take bribes. You skim from government budgets. Changing to inclusive institutions that protect property rights and allow competition, would threaten your power. So you do not change. You suppress anyone who tries. You use the military and police to maintain control. You rig elections. You jail opponents. And the country stays poor. This is why foreign aid often fails. Because aid flows to governments. And if the government is extractive, the aid gets stolen or wasted. It does not change institutions. It reinforces them. By giving money to corrupt governments, donors enable the very systems that keep countries poor. This is why simply giving money does not work. You cannot buy good institutions. They have to be built. And building them requires political change, which the elites resist, violently if necessary. There is another trap, the poverty trap. Poor countries cannot afford to invest in the things that would make them richer. A country needs infrastructure, roads, ports, electricity. These things are expensive. A poor country does not have the tax revenue to build them. So it borrows, but it cannot repay the debt because its economy is not growing. So it borrows more, and the debt compounds, and the country becomes trapped in a cycle of borrowing and stagnation. A poor country needs educated workers. But education is expensive. It requires schools, teachers, books. A poor family cannot afford to send children to school when those children could be working and earning money. So the children do not get educated, and the next generation is also poor. A poor country needs healthcare, but healthcare is expensive. A sick population is not productive, but the government cannot afford hospitals and doctors. So people stay sick, productivity stays low, and the economy does not grow. Breaking out of the poverty trap requires investment. But where does the investment come from? In rich countries, investment comes from savings. People save. Banks lend those savings to businesses. Businesses invest in equipment and expansion. The economy grows. But in poor countries, people do not save because they are too poor. They spend everything they earn just to survive. So there are no savings, no capital, no investment. And the economy stays stagnant. Foreign investment could break the cycle. If foreign companies invested in poor countries, they could bring capital, technology, and jobs. And this does happen. But foreign investors are cautious. They will not invest in a country where property rights are not protected, where contracts are not enforced, where the government might seize their assets, where corruption is rampant. So they do not invest, or they invest only in extractive industries. Oil, minerals, industries where they can get in, extract, and get out. These industries do not create broad-based prosperity. They create enclaves, fortified compounds where foreign workers live and local workers do menial labor. The wealth flows out of the country to shareholders in New York, London, or Beijing, and the local population stays poor. This is the resource curse at work. Countries with extractive institutions and valuable resources become poorer, not richer, because the resources create an incentive for elites to fight over control of the resource wealth rather than building productive economies. Nigeria is the perfect example, decades of oil wealth. And yet the country is poor because the oil money goes to politicians and elites. It does not fund infrastructure or education. It funds corruption. There is also a geographic trap. Some poor countries are landlocked. They have no access to the sea. Trade is expensive. Goods must be shipped through neighboring countries. And those neighbors often charge high fees or create bureaucratic delays. This makes exports uncompetitive. And without exports, the country cannot earn foreign currency, cannot import technology or capital goods, and cannot grow. Being landlocked is not fatal. Switzerland is landlocked and rich, but Switzerland has good institutions and wealthy neighbors with good infrastructure. A landlocked country in Africa, surrounded by other poor countries with bad roads and corrupt border officials, faces a much harder challenge. Geography matters, but it is not destiny. Singapore has no natural harbor. It built one. It has no fresh water. It built desalination plants. It has no resources. It became a trade and financial hub. Geography is an obstacle, but institutions determine whether a country overcomes that obstacle or is defeated by it. Culture is another factor people point to. Some cultures, they argue, value hard work, education, and savings. Others do not. And this explains why some countries are rich and others poor. There is some truth to this. Cultures do differ, but culture is not fixed. It changes in response to incentives. If your country has strong property rights, you will work hard and save, because you can keep what you earn. If your country does not protect property rights, you will not work hard, because anything you accumulate can be stolen, so you consume immediately. You do not save, you do not invest. This looks like a cultural difference, but it is a rational response to institutions. Chinese immigrants in Southeast Asia became wealthy, not because Chinese culture is superior, but because the institutions in places like Singapore and Malaysia allowed them to thrive. Chinese people in Mao's China, under communist institutions, starve by the millions. Same culture, different institutions, different outcomes. If you change the institutions, the culture changes. Blaming culture for poverty is a way of avoiding the real question. Why do countries have bad institutions? And why do those institutions persist? The answer is politics. Institutions are political. They are created and maintained by those in power. And those in power have no incentive to create institutions that limit their own power. If you're a dictator, why would you create an independent judiciary that could rule against you? Why would you allow free elections that could remove you from power? Why would you protect property rights if seizing property is how you reward your allies? You would not. And so bad institutions persist, not because people do not know better, but because changing them would require those in power to give up power, and they will not do that willingly. This is why revolutions so often fail. A dictator is overthrown. The people celebrate. A new leader takes power. And within a few years, the new leader is just as corrupt as the old one. Because the institutions did not change. The system that allowed the first dictator to steal and oppress is still in place, and the new leader uses the same system. This happened in much of Africa after independence. Colonial powers left. Local leaders took over, and many of them built the same extractive systems the colonizers had used, because those systems allowed them to enrich themselves. The people remained poor. Changing institutions requires more than replacing leaders. It requires changing the entire structure of power, and that is rare. It usually happens only after catastrophic collapse. Germany and Japan after World War II. South Korea after decades of dictatorship and economic crisis. Chile after the Pinochet era. These countries rebuilt their institutions from the ground up. But most countries do not experience the kind of collapse that forces institutional change. They muddle along, poor, stagnant, trapped. There is one more trap, the middle-income trap. Some countries escape poverty. They build factories, attract foreign investment, grow rapidly. They reach middle-income status, and then they stop. They cannot break through to high-income status. Why? Because the growth that got them to middle income was based on cheap labor. Factories relocated from rich countries to poor countries because wages were low. But as the country grows, wages rise. And once wages rise, the factories leave. They go to the next poor country with even cheaper labor. The middle-income country is left behind. It is no longer competitive in low-skill manufacturing. But it has not developed the technology, education, or institutions needed to compete in high-skill industries, so it stagnates. This is what happened to much of Latin America. Countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico grew rapidly in the mid-20th century, reached middle income, and then stopped. They have been stuck for decades. China is now facing this trap. It grew explosively for 40 years by being the world's factory. But wages have risen. Factories are leaving for Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Indonesia. China is trying to move up the value chain to compete in technology and innovation. But it faces the same problem every middle-income country faces. Moving from low skill to high skill requires institutions that encourage innovation. Strong property rights, rule of law, freedom of thought and expression. And China, under Xi Jinping, is moving in the opposite direction. More control, more censorship, less freedom. It may get stuck. So what does it take to escape? History shows there are a few paths. The first is to build inclusive institutions. Institutions that protect property rights, enforce contracts, limit government power, allow competition, encourage innovation. Countries that do this, even if they start poor, eventually become rich. But building these institutions is hard. It requires political change. And political change is resisted by those in power. The second path is external shock, war, collapse, occupation. Sometimes a country is forced to rebuild from scratch. And if the rebuilding is done right, with the help of external powers or internal reformers, good institutions can emerge. Germany and Japan after World War II. South Korea after decades of dictatorship. These countries were forced to change, and they built institutions that allowed them to thrive. But this path is rare and painful. The third path is incremental reform. A country with bad institutions slowly improves them, reduces corruption, strengthens courts, protects property rights, opens to trade. This is the path China took from 1978 onward. It did not become a democracy, but it improved its economic institutions enough to allow growth. The question now is whether it can continue without political reform. The evidence suggests it cannot. The fourth path is to be small, strategic, and lucky. Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, small city-states that positioned themselves as trade or financial hubs. They built good institutions, attracted global capital, and thrived. But this path only works for small places. It cannot work for a country of 100 million people. Most poor countries will stay poor. Not because they lack resources, not because they lack aid, not because of colonialism or geography or culture, but because they lack institutions. And changing institutions requires political change. And political change is resisted by those who benefit from the current system. Until that changes, until the elites in poor countries are forced or persuaded to build inclusive institutions, poverty will persist. This is the uncomfortable truth. Poverty is not a natural state. It is a political choice, made by those in power, enforced by extractive institutions, and sustained by the very systems that claim to fight it. Foreign aid does not change this. Giving money to corrupt governments reinforces the problem. What poor countries need is not aid. It is institutional reform, property rights, rule of law, limits on government power, freedom to trade and invest. But these things cannot be imposed from outside. They must be built from within, and that requires political will, which is rare. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. Poor countries stay poor because the systems that keep them poor are incredibly difficult to change. And until they change, the poverty trap will remain. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The Wealth Records. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.